Hello, welcome to Red Alert Alternative. This is a mod for the original Command & Conquer Red Alert. I am Dr. J, the mod's creator. I am creating these videos as a follow-up to a Let's Play of this mod done by Artega Omega. And I'm going to link to that playthrough in the description because I think that Artega's LP of the mod is absolutely fantastic. And I'm not just saying that because it's my mod. I've been a fan of Artega's work for about a decade at this point, so I definitely recommend checking him out. What these videos are is not going to be another complete playthrough of the game, because I think that would be pretty redundant when there's already a perfectly good start-to-finish LP of the mod out there. So instead, this is going to be what you might call a director's cut, where I'm going to pick a few specific missions, either because they changed significantly from the version that Artega played, because I have been making updates to the mod in response to feedback and things that I've noticed during his playthrough, or just pick missions to play that I think might be interesting to highlight for other reasons. And I'm going to provide some behind-the-scenes looks at the creation of the mod for people who might find that sort of thing interesting. So, for the director's cut, the first mission that I'm going to be playing through is Allies Mission 8, where you have to build turrets on the shore to sink some gunboats that are coming to attack your position. Because this is the first of the missions that change significantly from the version that Artega played for his playthrough. So here you can see this part hasn't changed. The long-range fixed artillery still shell your position to start with. And here's the force you get that has to go destroy the fixed artillery to start. Now the first thing that you'll notice has changed, if you saw or played the original version of this mission, is that originally this force was yellow or gold colored. And I made the missions for the mod originally so long ago that I don't remember my reasoning for every little decision. But I think that I just wanted to pick another ragtag color for the player to control besides brown. Brown is, of course, the main resistance color for the first part of the Allied campaign. And I just wanted to pick another color for the northern force you control that also had, you know, sort of a, I guess, grungy look to it. And I thought the yellow color in Red Alert was sort of grungy looking. So I think that's why I went with that. However, in retrospect, that's not really a very sensible decision, aesthetically speaking, because yellow, of course, is traditionally a very GDI color. And by the lore of this mod, the Allies are going to morph into Nod, and the Soviets are going to kind of morph into GDI. So the color choice didn't make a lot of sense. So the first thing I've done is change them from gold to gray, so that the northern force, the secondary force you control, has much more of a Nod aesthetic to it now. Because I think that getting the aesthetics right is important. But that, of course, is a pretty minor change, just changing the color of the secondary faction you control. So if that was the only thing that I had changed, I probably wouldn't bother showcasing this mission. But there's something else that has changed fairly significantly. Namely, when Artega played this mission, it had a crash bug. And what would cause the crash bug, I wasn't entirely certain at the time. And I also thought it was relatively rare. But seeing it happen to Artega made me realize, first of all, that the crash bug wasn't as rare as I thought it was. And secondly, that I think that I finally identified the pattern that caused it, where before I'd had only a vague notion. And the pattern is, so by way of explanation, I like to throw curveballs into my missions to keep them interesting, to keep the player on his toes, so that it's not just a simple by-the-numbers affair, to throw in some surprises and keep things interesting. And the curveball, I just realized I've been playing without music. Let's fix that. And the curveball for this particular mission is that the enemy deploys an MCV so that they can begin rebuilding the long-range fixed artillery. that you destroyed in the first part of the mission to begin shelling your base. But when I designed the mission, I realized that since the player does control this northern force, and it's not guaranteed to get destroyed, it got destroyed here because I'm playing fast rather than for minimizing casualties. But it's perfectly possible to keep part of your force alive. And that being the case, I couldn't really guarantee that the enemy could get their MCV down here, deploy it, and build everything unmolested. The player might well destroy the enemy's MCV before they can rebuild the fixed artillery. So to prevent that, I came up with the idea of the enemy, quote-unquote, deploying poison gas on the North Shore. And in game terms, all that actually means is I show a couple of signal flares to represent the poison gas, and then the units of the Northern Force have triggers on them, destroy triggers. And sometime after the poison gas trigger gets activated, I activate those destroy triggers on the Northern Force to cause them to be destroyed. The problem was, for reasons that to this day I don't entirely understand, something is happening in the Red Alert engine that is just kind of mysterious to me. The destroy trigger doesn't work on the APC in that northern group. And so if the APC survives the initial attacks, it will then not get destroyed by the force destroy trigger, even though by all appearances it seems like it should. And then, if it is subsequently destroyed normally by the enemy forces, then the game crashes. At least, I'm not 100% positive that is the pattern, but I'm now 90% positive that that was the sequence of events that would cause the crash bug up there. And so there are a number of ways that I could have fixed that crash bug once I realized exactly what was causing it. Like, maybe I could have just removed the APC, for example. But I decided to do a bit of a redesign. And now, instead of deploying their MCV on the northern shore and having to worry about the enemy's northern force destroying it, what happens is now there is a new island that didn't exist before in the previous version of the mission. That island is where the enemy is now going to set up their MCV to begin rebuilding the fixed artillery to shell my base. And that's the major change that has been made to the mission, because there's no way for the player to reach this island from either the northern or the southern shore. Which means that now I don't need to force destroy the northern force. I don't care about it at all anymore. And that takes care of the crash bug. The crash bug can no longer occur. And that's great, because obviously you want to avoid crash bugs in any games and mods you make whenever you can. You may hear, I don't know if the mic will pick it up, you may hear my cat Jolene meowing in the background. I don't know why she's meowing, I just fed her not that long ago, but she's a glutton. Her goal in life is to turn into a ball. One of my goals in life is to prevent that from happening by making sure she has a sensible diet. So, we will see the enemy building their MCV on the newly created island about 2/3 of the way through the mission. I often don't even bother to build a war factory during this mission, because you really don't need it. There's absolutely no reason to assault the enemy base that sends attacks against you for this mission, because the attacks are not actually terribly threatening. It's fairly easy to withstand them. And theoretically, it's maybe possible to destroy this base here within the time limit, but you don't have to for the sake of completing the mission. So I've actually never even tried it myself. Oh, these rocket soldiers. They're such a pain. Now, the enemy is going to drop some forces here. They're going to have an engineer drop from here, which is why I put this guard tower up. I might even put a second one just to be really safe. And they will, at some point, deploy an LST right around here. So aside from the major surprise in this mission, where the enemy rebuilds the fixed artillery, those are the other, I guess you could say, minor curveball attacks besides the attacks that the base to the east likes to send out at regular intervals. So, red alert. Oh, there's this airdrop. Red alert, as I have found from modding it, is a very buggy game. Now, I love Red Alert to death. It's one of my favorite games of all time. But that is certainly in spite of how very buggy it is. Westwood games in general have a tendency to have a lot of bugs. Now, I don't mean to throw shade on Westwood Studios with that comment, because they made a significant number of my favorite games of all time, so as far as I'm concerned, Westwood Studios is fantastic. But they did seem to have some difficulties with their programming. I remember reading an interview with one of the, I don't remember his exact role, a director, producer, or something on the original Command & Conquer, Tiberian Dawn, although it wasn't known as Tiberian Dawn at the time. And he kind of indirectly acknowledged Westwood's difficulties with programming, because he said that the filming for the game and the creation of the multimedia assets, the graphics and the sound and so on, had all been completed ahead of schedule, but that the programming was the bottleneck, is how he phrased it. And I kind of take that to mean that they had some difficulties getting everything to work. And you can kind of tell. I'm a professional software developer by trade, and I have a PhD in computer science, so this is kind of my jam. It's my specialty. And although I've never looked at Red Alert's source code or anything, I can kind of infer, just by watching how the game behaves in various ways, that a lot of things were done in a bit of a rough manner, and that they struggled to get some things to work correctly. But again, I'm not trying to throw shade on Westwood Studios with these comments, because they made really fantastic games. And we have to remember that they created these games back in the 1990s, when hardware was far more limited in its power than it is today. So they had some serious limitations to work under. And in the case of Command & Conquer and Red Alert, they were helping to pioneer a genre of game, real-time strategy, that barely existed at the time. Those weren't the first real-time strategy games ever, but they were still very early titles in the genre, so Westwood deserves a lot of slack for having been such early pioneers in this genre of game. So this is going pretty smoothly. This is actually not my first take recording this mission, and the first take was a lot rougher. And I discovered that it's not as easy to commentate and play well at the same time as veteran LPers like Artega make it look. It's actually pretty tricky, but I did some trial runs and I'm getting better at it, fortunately. I'm feeling so confident I might speed up the game temporarily until the enemy deploys their MCV on the island there. You will notice that the harvesters here are trying to harvest really far away ore, which is causing them to take longer to bring credits back to my base. The reason for that is because harvesters in Red Alert are programmed to want to harvest, and this isn't an ironclad rule, it's more of a tendency. But they are programmed to want to harvest from the northwest corner of ore fields. Okay, there's the enemy's MCV being deployed, so I'm going to slow things back down. Here, at this point, I give the player a couple of Chinook helicopters to give the player the opportunity to get some infantry over there to deal with this threat. Now, as I was saying, and yeah, on the subject of Red Alert bugs, they are resisting my attempts to get them into the Chinooks, because infantry are not the best at loading when you tell them to load. But yeah, harvesters like to try to harvest from the northwest corner of ore fields to the southeast. which is actually pretty bad behavior because it has balance implications. It means that overall, in general, you will harvest more slowly if you're on the eastern or southern side of an ore field than if you're north or west of it. Now, I actually didn't realize that was the behavior until after I had finished making the missions for this mod. Or I might have considered trying to design the missions to compensate. Oh, didn't realize that might happen. Gonna want to carefully keep my rocket soldiers out of range of that. Okay, please don't destroy my Chinooks, I might need them. Okay, since I was dealing with that, I kind of lost my train of thought. Ooh, that could be a problem. Rocket soldiers are so bad at dealing with rifle infantry that one guy could kill a lot of my rocket soldiers. Oh no. Okay, so this is going poorly. I'm going to have difficulty destroying the enemy's base that they're setting up there before they rebuild the long-range fixed artillery the way this is going. And yeah, as I was saying, I might have considered trying to design the maps to compensate for the fact that harvesters have kind of a dumb harvesting pattern, had I realized that's how they work from the beginning. But then again, maybe not. Because what exactly would I do? Make sure that the player is always to the east or south of an ore field? That seems kind of silly. So maybe I just would have left it alone. In fact, I probably would have, even had I known that that was the behavior from the beginning. But yeah, that's one of many examples of sort of some suboptimal programming in the Red Alert engine. Because that is not good behavior due to its balance implications. That's probably good enough. Okay, they are now beginning to rebuild the long-range fixed artillery. It's possible to survive the mission even with them rebuilding those and shelling your position, but it's certainly not ideal. They're rebuilding that flame tower a great deal, which is proving problematic. But that's not a bad thing. This is supposed to be challenging to deal with, so I'm not upset that I'm having a bit of difficulty knocking out their construction yard and preventing the rebuilding of the artillery here. Come on, yeah, good job. Now, any turrets I destroy will be permanent damage, and I just need to destroy enough that I can get at that artillery and knock it out. Good. Hopefully they'll stay out of range of the flame turrets. Well, one guy is still alive, and they're not repairing the turret, so... Alright, good. All is well. You'll notice that they weren't repairing any of these buildings up here. It's not because I programmed them not to repair the buildings. It is because there is a flag on buildings to tell the AI whether to repair them or not. And due to yet another example of questionable programming, whenever the AI builds a new building or rebuilds a building that was destroyed, it is built with that flag turned off. So buildings that were destroyed and rebuilt, and buildings that didn't exist at the start of the mission that the AI was told to create, will never be repaired, because they're built with that flag turned off, and there is nothing that you as a level designer can do to turn it on. So yeah, another example of some of the suboptimal programming in the Red Alert engine. Which, you know, just to say once again, I love Red Alert, so I'm not saying that to suggest that I dislike this game, but, you know, shoddy programming is shoddy programming. And it's something to talk about, so I will call it out. And it's kind of interesting. And you see, just Harvesting from west to east. If I were west of this ore field, I'd be pulling in money a lot faster. Alright, so the enemy gunboats, or I call them gunboats even though they're obviously red alert destroyers because I modeled their stats off of the gunboats in Tiberian Dawn because I really liked how powerful they were, and it made them as naval units feel more special. And I feel like the naval units in Red Alert, with the exception of the cruiser, and then in Aftermath the missile subs, just didn't feel very powerful to me. It makes them just feel like tanks on water, because you can build swarms of Red Alert destroyers, and you kind of have to get good damage output out of them. And don't even get me started on Red Alert gunboats. I like it when naval units feel much more powerful and special, so that's why I really beefed up the destroyers and modeled them after the Tiberian Dawn gunboats. Even with the addition of this island, if I didn't have the defenses here, they could still get to the far side through this gap and cause me to lose the mission. So I made sure of that the mission is still losable by the gunboats, or excuse me, the destroyers getting through. But this is more than enough turrets to take care of them, even as powerful as they are. And that's that. Mission accomplished. Cutscene, I think, is going to be unbelievably loud, so I'm not going to try to talk over it. That is obviously a cruiser sinking there in that ending cutscene, and not a destroyer, but I wasn't so crazy that I was going to make my own custom videos for this mod. There are mods that have done that, and that's amazing, but I wasn't going to go to quite those lengths, so I just worked with the pre-existing cutscenes that were already there, which means a lot of times I had to pick something that didn't quite line up perfectly. But anyway, that does it for this inaugural installment of Command & Conquer Red Alert Alternative Director's Cut, showing off the ways in which Allies Mission 8 changed, the changing of the color of the Northern Force to a better Nod Gray, and changing the deploying of the enemy MCV and the rebuilding of the artillery to take place on that island instead of on the northern shore, so that I no longer had to force destroy the player's northern forces, thus completely bypassing what had been causing the crash bug. So no more crash bug, huzzah! But wait, there's more. I said that this was going to include some behind-the-scenes look at Red Alert Alternative, and I wasn't kidding. So I've pulled up here the text file corresponding to the mission that we just watched. So this is the format of what Red Alert missions look like. Now I'm going to resist the urge to try to go through this comprehensively, because I think that would take a really long time and I don't want to risk boring people. But I am going to go through this file briefly and highlight what are hopefully a few areas of interest for people who are interested in how things are working behind the scenes. So first, in these mission files and other game files for Red Alert and Command & Conquer and Tiberian Sun, etc., any line that is prepended with a semicolon is a comment, which means that the game parser completely ignores the line. And you can basically just use comments as notes to yourself for human consumption only, and the game just completely ignores them. Now this here is editing the stats for a particular structure or unit on an individual mission-by-mission basis. In this case, the anti-aircraft gun has had its stats changed to serve as the long-range fixed artillery. Now, of course, the rules.ini file is where I applied most of the changes to building and unit stats for the mod, but I will sometimes override them on an individual mission basis, which you can do. However, it's not 100% reliable. Sometimes the game will ignore attempts to make changes to certain buildings or units, especially where names are concerned. So for example, this is kind of jumping ahead in the campaign quite a bit, But later on, you get Soldier Volkov, the commando for the Soviet forces. And the unit that represents both Soldier Volkov and other generic commandos in the mod is known as the GNRL unit, which stands for General. And because the General unit isn't used just for Volkov, in rules.ini, I set its name to Commando. And if you mouse over Volkov when you have him in missions, you see that his name is still just Commando. That's not because I didn't think of changing it or because I didn't try. I did try to change his name to Volkov just like this for missions where he appears. The game completely ignores my attempts to do that, however. And sometimes trying to change this name parameter can even cause the game to crash. For example, in Soviet 9, the very experimental mission that takes place in the Soviet commander's consciousness, when I tried to change the name of the powered-up Soviet commander that comes out of the church, I tried to change it to True Self. When I did that, if I moused over that unit to see its name, the game would crash. So changing names on an individual mission basis seems really unreliable. Changing other stats usually works fairly well. That's not 100% reliable, but it mostly is. It certainly works much better than changing the name. So that's what a lot of this stuff is just unit tweaks. This basic section is where you set general parameters for the mission, such as the mission name, which is invisible to the player. This is not a player-facing piece of data, so this is kind of just for internal use only. And you can set things like what cutscenes to play at the beginning of the mission when the player wins or loses, and a bunch of other settings as well, but I won't go through all of them individually. I will just note that you're theoretically supposed to play which musical theme, or supposed to set which musical theme plays at the beginning of the mission, but it often just ignores this setting completely, so that doesn't seem to work all that great either. This is where you set the basic parameters of the map. Its width, its height, whether it's in the temperate or snow theater. Waypoints are where you identify particular cells or spaces on the map. You call them out for use by triggers and for use by teams. So for example, you can order a team go to waypoint 36. And that's just more convenient than referring to the actual numbers of cells. So that's what that's for. The map pack is where the basic terrain information for the map is defined. And this looks like gobbledygook. This is actually known as Base64 Encoding. And this is a little bit technical, but essentially what this is it's a way of taking purely binary data, which is not meant to be displayed in text format. And if you try, it just shows up as garbage characters, not like regular letters and numbers, but just weird random characters. And Base64 encoding is a way of changing how that information is interpreted by the computer so that it can be displayed as normal text, so you can look at it in a plain text editor like this without risk of data getting corrupted or without having to look at a bunch of hideous unprintable characters. So it's a way of storing binary data in files that have a mixture of binary data and plain text data. So that's what this is. And you can tell that it's Base64 encoding by these equal signs at the end. Those are basically a placeholder for when the data does not align perfectly. Don't worry about it too much if you don't understand that, because that is highly technical. Overlay pack is the same thing, except it's for ore and walls, I think, are the main things that count as overlay. This is where you actually define the different factions for a mission. And internally, the factions are identified by country names, like USSR, Ukraine, Greece, England, and so on. In multiplayer, these country names are meaningful. You can actually pick them as your faction. In single player, however, these country names are meaningless. This information is totally invisible to the player during single player missions. And what they actually represent in terms of what the player can see is the color of the faction. So for example, USSR is red, Ukraine is orange, Greece is blue, and so on and so forth. That's what's more meaningful from the player's perspective. And the other major thing that the country represents is it determines whether that faction counts as Allied or Soviet units for the purposes of scoring and determining how many points the player gets at the end of a mission. Now, an interesting oddity to that is that the Soviets only get 3 factions: USSR, Ukraine, and Bad Guy. And both USSR and Bad Guy are the exact same red color, so there's actually 2 different factions with the same red color, and then Ukraine is orange. The Allies get, I think, 7 factions. Greece, which is blue, England, which is green, Germany, which is that nod gray that we saw, France, which is kind of a teal or a green-blue color, Spain, which is the sort of GDI gold, Turkey, which is brown, so that's the color that the player is for the majority of the Allied campaign in Red Alert Alternative when they're just the resistance, and Good Guy, which is blue, just like Greece is blue. So the Allies also get 2 factions that have the exact same color palette. I suspect that Turkey was meant to be a Soviet side, and that it doesn't count as a Soviet side due to yet another Red Alert bug, because Westwood Studios uses Turkey, which again is brown, as though it were a Soviet faction in some of the official missions. And yet it counts as Allied casualties in the missions where it appears, which actually screws up the scoring. So I think that the Soviets were supposed to get 4 factions. That's just me theorizing. They actually only get 3, and the Allies get 7. As a level designer, if you want the scoring to be correct, and I do because I'm kind of a perfectionist, this is a slightly annoying point, because the Soviets have far fewer factions that you can work with when determining AI behavior in that, whereas the Allies are, just filthy with factions that you can use to give them a whole bunch of different sides for the purposes of determining their AI behavior and setting triggers and that kind of thing. You can also determine which other sides count as allies to each faction. Determine a faction's starting credits. This number is multiplied by 100, so 30 actually means 3,000. And for computer-controlled factions, you can set their IQ, which determines how autonomously they behave, as well as how smart they are about certain things. The base section is for defining when you want the AI to build a base that doesn't already exist. You can tell it exactly what buildings to create, in what order, and where you want it to put them. You can only define this for a single faction. So you actually can't define a base layout to construct for more than a single faction in a mission. That's just one of the limitations you have to work with as a level designer in the Red Alert engine. Structures is just the placement of pre-existing structures on the map, who they belong to, what the structure is, its starting health, where it's located, its facing, triggers attached to it, and so on. Pretty self-explanatory, I think. Units corresponds to vehicles. Terrain is for trees, ore veins, and ice flows, and it is not Base64 encoded, unlike the base terrain layer. So it's actually human readable, although figuring out which cell 11,190 corresponds to would be a bit of a pain. Infantry section. And now we come to the heart of the scripting for Red Alert missions. Team types and triggers. As I said, I'm not going to go into the details of what all this means, because it would take hours to do that, and I have a feeling most people would fall asleep. Some enterprising individuals in the CNC and Red Alert community pretty early on cracked the format for the scripting, for the triggers and the team types, and determined what all of these numbers mean. And while this format probably looks extremely complicated, it's not as hard as you would think. Each of the numbers are basically just codes for certain behaviors that you want to specify. And once you know what an individual number means for its given position in this comma-separated list, it's just a matter of remembering what the numbers mean or looking them up, if you want to write the scripts by hand, which I don't recommend. Again, it's actually not that hard to do once you understand the format, but it's slow and tedious, so I actually don't really recommend doing it that way. And then team types is for defining groups of units and how you want them to act. So like, for example, 2 Tank 2, Jeep 2, V2RL1, LST1 means this is a group consisting of 1 LST, a V2 rocket launcher, 2 Rangers, and 2 medium tanks. And then after that, this sequence of numbers specifies the orders that the team is to follow. So this particular team type is the enemy's LST drop that they attempt to do on your northern shore during the mission. Cell triggers I'm going to explain in just a moment. And that pretty much covers it. That is a very quick and dirty overview of the text format. So this is what Red Alert mission files look like if you crack them open and look at them in a plain text editor. It's not as difficult to understand as you might expect it to be, because all you have to do is look up the Red Alert mission creation guide, and it will tell you what all of these seemingly confusing numbers mean. So you can easily find that online if you're actually really interested in more information about that. But wait, there is still more. So I kind of alluded to the fact that I don't really recommend editing Red Alert mission files by editing those text files directly. You can, and there are certain things that I do edit in the text file directly, but actually I strongly recommend using a mission editor instead. So this is the most important tool that I used while I was creating the mod. It's not the only tool I used, but it was definitely the most critical, because this is the mission editor that I used. It is called the Red Alert Scenario Editor, or RAED, even though the acronym RAED obviously does not equate to the name Red Alert Scenario Editor at all. And so I'm going to bring up the mission that we were just talking about. And here you can see what it looks like in the editor window. So RAED is really handy because it's much easier to place units and structures and place waypoints and all that kind of thing by just pointing and clicking than by manually figuring out what coordinates to put in by hand for where to place everything. So it's a huge time saver to place the bases, place the walls, place everything really in this editor rather than trying to do it by hand. And you can even directly place the terrain in this editor if you'd rather do it in the same tool that you're using rather than placing the terrain in the default Red Alert map editor and then switching to this tool to place all the units and stuff. And that's typically what I did when I was making this mod, was just create the map and place all the units and structures and stuff using this editor. But what's even more handy is here in the menu you can see under AI there's team types and triggers. And so if you would rather not have to memorize or be constantly looking up what all those numbers mean and plugging all that information into the text file by hand, which is also pretty error prone, this editor provides a complete graphical user interface for specifying the teams and the scripting for missions. And again, I'm not going to get into a huge amount of depth and detail here because that would take a really long time. But just to give you sort of a quick overview, for example, here we have this team type that I named Dick, not because I was trying to be vulgar, but because what this team type does, as you can see with this specification here, it's a V2 rocket launcher. It is supposed to move to waypoint 31, which is on the ridge overlooking the player's base, right here, waypoint 31. And its following orders are to attack factories, meaning production structures, then power facilities, then base defenses, and then any other buildings. So what it's supposed to do is just park itself right here and start destroying the player's base from up here, which is kind of a dick move, and that's why I called that team type Dick. And Actually, what it usually does is it moves to this waypoint as ordered, and then just drives around straight up into the player's defenses and gets itself destroyed. That's because the AI behaves semi-autonomously, and oftentimes the orders that you give it as a level designer, it almost treats them more like guidelines than as absolute commands, and sometimes it just kind of does its own thing. What I probably should have done, and I think might have made it behave the way I wanted to better, is instead of all this, I probably should have just given it the command to go into what is known as, if I can find it here, this text is actually really small on my screen right now, sticky mode. Sticky, the order sticky, basically tells the unit to just sit on that space and refuse to move no matter what. So I think if I had used that command, it would have done a better job of forcing that, actually SSM launcher. You know, internally it's called the V2 rocket launcher, but they got reflavored as SSM launchers for the mod. I think that would have done a better job of making it sit up there atop that ridge to shell the player's base from there. So that's an example of how to define a team type. And then here are the triggers. This is sort of the heart of the scripting for the mission. And just to look at a very simple example, here we have the win trigger, which says that when 4 units have been destroyed belonging to Ukraine, which remember, Ukraine is orange, so that's the missile boats that, and there's 4 of them, that you have to sink in order to win the mission. So when 4 units belonging to Ukraine are destroyed, winner is Turkey, which is the player faction. So that's the win condition for this particular mission. And that's an example of what a trigger looks like. Triggers can be a bit more complex than this because you can specify 2 separate conditions. And you can say that both of the conditions have to be met, or that one or the other can be met. And there can be 1 or 2 actions that you trigger when the conditions are met. And you can also set variables, which in Red Alert parlance are called globals, and add logic based on variables. You can set triggers to happen only once, or to happen over and over again every time their conditions are met. So you can set up loops that way. Although in some ways it's primitive, the Red Alert engine's scripting system is actually more flexible than I think some people might give it credit for. And I think I proved that with this mod, where I have some missions that managed to do some pretty fancy stuff. So that was just a quick and dirty look, a brief overview of how I did mission editing for this mod and the main tool that I used for that purpose. I could go into way more detail than this because there's a very wide variety of triggers that you can use and a lot of really fancy tricks that you can do if you know what you're doing. But I didn't want to go into too much detail because I didn't want to put people to sleep. However, if that's something that you think you might be really interested in, just leave a comment and let me know, and maybe I'll make a video later on going into more depth about how to do scripting. Oh, I almost forgot that I had promised to talk about the cell triggers. I'll do that as the final thing in this video. These green boxes with text in them, which obviously are invisible to the player. We didn't see this when we were playing the mission. These are cell triggers. Basically, you can attach a trigger to a space on the map and say, when a unit belonging to a certain faction enters one of these spaces, activate the associated trigger. So that's what cell triggers are for. Now, the Red Alert engine doesn't allow you to get super specific with cell triggers, so you can't say, when a unit of a specific type enters a cell trigger, do X. You can only say when any unit belonging to a particular faction enters a space, then do X. So that's one of the many limitations that you have to work with when you're doing Red Alert scripting. And you'll notice that these cell triggers are 2 rows deep, because sometimes they fail to fire. If they're only 1 row deep, a unit might go right through that 1 row and somehow not trigger it. But they pretty much trigger with 100% reliability if they're 2 rows deep. So it's one of the many little oddities or quirks of the Red Alert engine that you want to be aware of if you want to be a skillful level designer for this game. Alright, so hopefully that was fairly interesting. If you're mostly just here for the gameplay, then don't worry, I am mostly going to be doing gameplay videos, so I'm not planning on doing a ton of these sort of deep dive behind the scenes looks unless there's a lot of interest in that. Feel free to leave comments saying what kinds of content you'd like to see, and I'll certainly consider any requests. So I've babbled for long enough. I'll go ahead and wrap up the first video here. I hope that you enjoyed it. This is Dr. J signing off. Have a good one.